Hello, I'm Steve Feldman, president of the Human Animal Bond Research Institute. Welcome to Pet Week on Capitol Hill. This is an amazing session that we have for you today. If this is your first session, make sure you come to petnight.com and look at the schedule and see all of our other amazing conversations about the importance of pets in our lives. Today's session is brought to us by some important sponsors. Thank you so much for making today possible. And thanks to all the sponsors of Pet Week on Capitol Hill for bringing us these virtual conversations about the human-animal bond and pets in our lives. Our special guest today, I'm so excited that she's joining us. Dr. Kerry O'Hara has 30 years of experience in business research and data analysis and strategy development, and more than 15 of those years has been in the pet space. So I can think of no one better to talk to us about the importance of pets in the economy, the importance of pets in our family life. Dr. O'Hara has two PhDs, one in clinical psychology and one in industrial organizational psychology. The combination of her education and her years of experience really makes her the one to help us think about pet ownership in America and to bring us some amazing data. Please welcome Dr. Kerry O'Hara.
Thank you, Steve, for that kind introduction. I feel it's a privilege and always look forward to Pet Week on Capitol Hill. There's a great amount of organizations that both sponsor and attend this key pet industry event every year. So I'm excited again to be a part of it. So let's talk about strategic insights from the National Pet Owner Survey. This study is one of the platinum products in our industry that helps to uncover trends among pet owners to advance the intelligence of all organizations in the pet industry. Also, it's there to educate non-industry decision makers as to the influence pets have in our lives and how we make decisions, how we behave, and how we choose to spend our money, even in uncertain economic times. We have an ever-growing industry, but understanding the changing dynamics of pet owners, their needs and their behaviors can be a challenge, especially with our newest sector, Generation Z, entering the category as pet owners and exerting their influence for the very first time. So what are we going to cover today? Well, first, pets are important to the American economy, very much so. We're going to talk about the types of pets that Americans own, the number of households that own pets, the sheer largesse of how and the ubiquitous nature that pets have in our lives. And also, along with the largesse of that industry, how the spend in that industry has been affected over time. One thing that I like to do as a statistician, as a psychologist, is to get out of the discussion of year-over-year changes, which I think can be varied in how people prioritize things and individual shifts of economic decisions and all that kind of thing. So looking at grander swaths of time, 10 plus years, to really unpack how people are making decisions is important. So you'll see in this presentation that we take a longer view of human behavior. And then something that I also alluded to earlier, and Steve certainly did in his intro, is generational differences. You know, we're always seeking to understand how individual generations make decisions. We're all very different from each other. I'm a member of Generation X, and how we behaved was very different from the builder generation and from our parents, the boomer generation. And as we have unpacked in numerous studies previous to today and this year, we've really started to understand millennials and how they make decisions and what's important to them in their lives. And really, for the first time, we're really starting to unpack the newest generation, Generation Z, and really starting to see how their decisions and how their influence is going to be even more important moving forward. But for the first time, what we're seeing is that the two younger generations, Zs and millennials, now equal in largesse the older generations, myself included, and boomers. And so really understanding their impact on our economy, on our industry, and on non-industry is very important. So let's dive right in. So think about this for a couple of minutes. 66% of all U.S. households own a pet. 66%. That's 2/3 of all households. Your constituents own a pet. As you can see from this graph, this table, they're mostly dogs and cats. 50% of all the households in the United States own a dog. That's incredible. So when you think about how people make decisions, how they prioritize things in their lives, certainly understanding how pets, how people account, how pet owners account for their pets is a very important part of how you think through their decision making, what's important to them. But look at, again, let's look at this in a longer period of time. So these graphs down here look at the pet ownership rates over time from 2010 to 2022. For the most part, the percentages are on the left and the millions are on the right. For the most part, what you see is that pet ownership, the actual percentage hasn't varied grandly over the past 12 years. It's hovered somewhere between 64 and about 67% pretty steadily for about 10 plus years. Now we do see variation. That's the reason why I don't have individual years, the numbers posted on here, because you do see some individual variation in year-over-year comparisons. But for the most part, especially with the average number or the estimated number of households, you see that steadily climb over time. One thing that we do see that has changed over the past several years is the number of multi-pet households. Even though the percentage of U.S. households has remained pretty steadily in the mid to upper 60s, what we see are current pet owners re-engaging with pet ownership and getting more pets involved in their lives. And this trend has upticked over the past 6-7 years. So important to understand that. What is the pet influence right this very second? Well, if you think about 66% of your US households have pets, that means that 115 million voters live in households where pets are a priority for them. And we're going to unpack how much pets are a priority for them in the coming slides. What I'm trying to drive home, and what's very important to understand, is that the pet business is American business. Again, let me drive that home. Pet business is American business. A grand swath of your voters, of your constituents, have pets as a very important, integral part of their lives. So let's unpack the American business side of it. Last year alone, just in 2022, there was a Michigan State University study that unpacked the overall economic impact of the pet industry at $260 billion. That's 1 year alone, $260 billion in this industry, the economic impact. That's an increase in just 7 years of 18%, an 18% increase in 7 years, which is really interesting given what's happened in the past 7 years, which we'll unpack a little bit more. So again, I like to look at grander swaths of time to really understand how people behave and how they're spending money. So this chart looks at the period of time from 2009 to 2023, estimates of year-end 2023, given the first 6 months, to see how people are spending money. And as you can see, you have to remember, in 2009, we were in the deep throes of a recession. Certainly the housing market was grandly affected. How people were spending money was grandly affected, but you still see a steady state of pet spend in our industry. However, when we looked at individual things in a different study that I had done with Nationwide a couple of years ago, is that between 2009 and about 2014, things like veterinary spend, that were not commoditized, like food and flea and tick medicines, things like that, pharma, things that were not commoditized services type things, were at a deflationary tick, whereas the commodities we saw were increasing just at the rate that things like pharma moved and food moved. We did see that in 2015, we're starting to get out of that recession and people are starting to spend more in our category. So really for this 11-year period of time, the compound annual growth rate has an average of a little under 5%. That accounts for the deflationary period during the recessionary years and then the recovery period right after that. However, let's look at the difference between 2020 and 2022. We start to see some differences. Now, remember in 2020, I think we all remember in 2020, there was a little thing that happened called COVID. During COVID, the industry had lots of things like clear the shelter campaign. So pet ownership really leapt in 2020. Multi-pet households really leapt in 2020. Inflation hadn't really hit at that time. So you really start to see what I call an elbow bend distribution of spend in our industry. Now, certainly in 2021, things like inflation really started to hit. So a lot of this CAGR that we see, the almost 10% CAGR we've seen between 2020 and 2022, there is some influence of inflation in that. Certainly things like food, between 2021 and 2022, we saw a 14% increase just year over year. But for the most part, what we see is that the largesse of this industry, the fact that people prioritize pets as part of their lives, really demonstrates how Americans are prioritizing their spend. So again, to drive it home, in the recession era and the post-recession era, we saw an average CAGR, compound annual growth rate, of a little under 5%. But since COVID and the grand uptick of pet owners in our lives, we see that the CAGR has drastically shifted to just under 10%. So what does this mean? Is it all inflation? Now, certainly, as I said, a lot of it has to do with inflation. The cost of everyday things has definitely increased. And I think that everybody on this call can appreciate how much the inflation has influenced our lives. But when we asked people to think through, and this is last year in 2022, when we asked people how the current economy has affected their pet ownership, 2/3 of the sample said that the economic conditions have not affected their ability to provide for their pets. So in other words, their pet ownership has not been affected by the current economy. That's important to know because it educates how people are prioritizing their spend. They have, the pressure on their wallet is affected by the inflation, but given what you prioritize as a household, that educates how you spend your money. And it looks like pet ownership right now has not been affected. And certainly when we look at the difference between 2020 pre all this inflation and 2022, when inflation has been, the highest, we do see some influence on how people have said that they spend the money. We're going to look at generational differences moving forward. The interesting trend, though, is that even with inflation and pressure on people's wallets, pet spending doesn't seem to change. In 2022, most pet owners said that they actually, or a lot of pet owners said that they actually spent more on their pets than they did pre-inflationary times. And guess what? It was actually millennials, our younger pet owners, and Gen Z, our youngest pet owners, that said that their uptick of online spend actually increased regardless of inflation on pet products. So what accounts for this prioritization of pet spending, even as there's increased pressure on people's wallets? Well, that's the reason why I'm here today. I'm such a huge fan of organizations like HABRI, because HABRI really tries to highlight that the human-animal bond explains a lot of human behavior, and how people form their attitudes absolutely educates how they behave, how they spend money, and how they prioritize things. And so when you have studies that unpack that 98% of pet owners agree that pets are an important part of their family, when you look at stats that say that pet owners, they personally experience improved health, up 5% over the past couple of years. 87% of pet owners say they have experienced mental health benefits. I could actually create probably 20 slides on the perceived health benefits, the perceived and actual health benefits of pet ownership. And certainly the human animal bond indicates that it's not just pets that bring value to our lives, but we bring value to our pets' lives. It's a relationship because of the mutual bond and the appreciation of the influence and the good things that pets provide to us. Certainly things like physical health benefits, mental health benefits, psychological health benefits, all of the things that are unpacked as a part of people's lives. You hear about the things like, loneliness epidemic and how older generations experience acute loneliness, younger generations, because they're raised on their smartphones, and especially all generations because of COVID, experience acute levels of loneliness. Well, pets help to bring a safety net, and as human beings, we appreciate that safety net that they provide for us. And so there is a desire to take care of the things that take care of us. So let's switch directions a little bit and talk about generational differences. Certainly how people act is very interesting. As I said, I'm part of Gen Z, and how my generation acted is a lot different than the youngest generation, Gen Zs, interact with the pet industry. So let's unpack some of that. One of the most exciting things that we're starting to see is the impact of Gen Z on the pet industry and outside the pet industry. If you think about Gen Zs, or the people that are born from 1995 to 2004, you're really starting to see them age into a lot of categories. Now, certainly, a lot of them are not, bona fide pet owners at this yet, but we're seeing, or they don't own pets on their own because maybe they're still in college, or they live with their parents where they share responsibility for pet ownership. But the sheer numbers that we're seeing from Gen Z and add them into the millennial mix means that for the first time, the younger generations in sheer numbers equals the older generations. And certainly understanding how the differences with their attitudes and how they behave is very important to understand. Of course, younger generations are much more influenced about, how the economy influences their ability to spend on their pets, the expense of pet ownership, things like that. Older generations really are focused on the benefits of pet ownership and maintaining level of care. We don't have time to talk too much about that, but the maintaining the level of care, there's been a lot of pressure on our industry. Things like access to care, access to veterinarians, ability to receive care for your pet are still weighing heavily on people's minds, especially with older generations. But when we're looking at just the numbers of pet ownership, some interesting things, especially over time, some interesting things emerge. So the first thing to note is that in terms of percentages, millennials still rule this industry. There are far more millennials than any other generation that own both dogs and cats in our category. So understanding millennials is still a very important piece of the puzzle. And their percentage of pet ownership has only increased over time. We saw in 2020 that this generation alone was one of the biggest generation that became first-time pet owners. So really, millennials still rule this category more than any other. A couple other things to note, though: Gen X and Boomers. We've seen that over time, their numbers are slowly starting to wane in favor of millennials, and now Gen Z. We really are starting to see an uptick in their ownership of dogs and cats. So what we're starting to see is if you think of our industry as an ever-changing living thing, we're starting to see that older generations, their attitudes, behaviors, and how they make decisions is slowly starting to wane, whereas we see an uptick in ownership, influence, and how they make decisions starting to increase with younger generations. So certainly, how understanding how pets influence their lives is really important to capture their focus. we talk about the human animal bond, and certainly I spoke about it in the universal, but interesting to note a couple of things about the human animal bond. It's important to know, and of course, with 98%, you would think that it is a universally experienced piece of the puzzle with pet ownership. And certainly, if you look at generational differences of the experiences of the human animal bond, you see that it is universally experienced amongst all generations. Older generations, though, Xers and Boomers, are really focused on the happiness, emotional support, stress relief characteristics of how pets add value to our lives, whereas we see the younger generations using pets, or really using the safety net of a pet to help them with things like anxiety and depression. So pets add value to your life is universally known experience. So we're happy that there are organizations like HABRI that really help us understand how pets influence our lives and how we can give back to pets as part of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Hara. That was such incredibly powerful data, really illustrating how central pets are in the lives of Americans. So you talked about the connection between the human-animal bond and pet spending and the influence on the economy. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that the human animal bond, I know that certainly HABRI has been on the forefront of studying this over time. If you think through 30 years ago, how Americans interacted with their pets, we still saw some things like, people keeping their dogs chained up outside. Certainly the unit or the pet moving inside as part of our essential part of our lives has really changed. I know a lot of my colleagues talk about, the influence of dogs moving from the outside of the house to now they're sleeping on our beds. So what this talks through is that the human animal bond is only getting stronger over time. And certainly as we're seeing younger pet owners that have only had pets as a central part of the family unit has changed. And so how they're influenced by their pet ownership will also change our industry. And think through, how people make decisions. They prioritize things according to what they think is important. That educates their decision making. It educates their decision making. Their how they prioritize things, and certainly how they choose to spend money. So understanding the human animal bond is only going to be more important moving forward.
I'm glad you mentioned generational differences. You mentioned pets sleeping on the bed. I think for some young pet owners, that's not even enough. Then now the pets are under the covers wearing matching pajamas. But elaborate a little more on those generational differences. I thought it was fascinating to see that now they make up a little more than half of all pet owners. Talk about the significance of that as it relates to the future of pet ownership.
Well, we're always seeking to understand how people behave because we want to influence, the happiness they experience in their lives, and certainly want to influence how they interact with our industry, hoping to get them to really engage with our industry. Well, we're seeing the differences with younger pet owners, and certainly because they're just aging into the category, we're just starting to understand how they are, how they're different than other generations. But, one thing that we find really interesting is that, and of course, someone from my X generation has a grand appreciation for this. A lot of these pet owners, these newer pet owners, were raised with things like smartphones, personal computers, which were an option when I was in high school. But certainly, they have computer access from the moment they are born to today, and so understanding how they want to learn about things, how they make decisions, is very different than how the X generation, the Boomer generation, how we impart information, how we want to learn about things, and certainly how we interact with different business sectors. One thing that is really interesting, it's not part of this study, but it's part of the larger National Pet Owner Survey, which will be available in a couple of weeks, is that when you look at millennial and Z pet owners, the way that they want to learn about things, the way that they want to interact with people is through visual means. So if you look at how they learn about pet products, for instance, you see that things like, Google, #1 search engine for Xers and boomers, #1 search engine for millennials and Zers, YouTube. When interacting with social media, #1 for Xers and boomers, things like Facebook. Younger generations, they want video, they want TikTok, they want Instagram. So really just understanding how these generations interact and the very different nature how they interact has grand implications for marketing departments, strategy, people, influence networks. How they're very different than the older generation. So I think getting our arms around how all of these different platforms are influencing their behavior and how they're making decisions is going to be even more insightful moving forward.
Yeah, that's amazing. Certainly, there's a proliferation of pets with their own Instagram feed, and
Yes.
and certainly quite a bit of pet TikTok.
Oh, yes, there is.
All right. So, but we have a lot of folks who are members of these younger generations, but who are also congressional staff who are helping our nation make policy, who are serving their constituents. What's the most important thing from all this data that you want members of Congress to know?
Well, I am a psychologist. So the #1 thing that I look at are people, and I've been studying human decision making for 30 plus years. So the #1 thing I want you to know is that pets influence our decision making, very much so. And our decision making is how we decide how we spend money, how we prioritize things. So understanding how important, how integral pets are to the family unit, to our decision making, to our prioritization of certain things, is how you will eke success. I think moving forward, they have moved from the backyard to our bedroom, to our TikTok, to their influence networks are huge. So really unfolding the ever evolving influence of pets in our lives, I think is a very important unit of study. Thanks, Steve.
Well, thank you, Dr. O'Hara, for your time and for your insights. I also want to thank the American Pet Products Association and all the members of the American Pet Products Association all around the United States who are doing so much to help us care for our pets and working to strengthen the human-animal bond in our families and in our communities. Thank you so much for being here.
Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Dr. Kerry O'Hara for an amazing presentation. And thanks again to our session sponsors. You are leaders in strengthening the human-animal bond. Thank you so much for bringing us this session today. Thanks to all of our Pet Week sponsors for helping us care for our pets and for making Pet Week on Capitol Hill possible. I hope everyone comes back to petnight.com or the Highbury Facebook page to see all of our Pet Week sessions, informative, interesting conversations about pets in our lives. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you soon.